thanks for coming here. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thank you. I, as I said, I really enjoy your show. So,
okay. So can you explain to me, and I know you've done this well on other shows, but how does the banking system work? I know everybody thinks about how like the bankers control the world. It's like the bankers, the intelligence agencies, and the money washing with the drug cartels and all this stuff with funding, wars and overthrowing countries. And there's so much going on here. But the very top level of all of this stuff is the bankers, right?
Right. So here's how any business, any enterprise and any planet has a business model, an economic model on how the fundamental walk. So the Western world for 500 plus years has operated on a model called central banking warfare model. Okay, the central bankers print money out of thin air, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, but they create the money, and then the military makes sure that people take it. Okay, and that keeps the liquidity going. So there are two sides to the coin. And when you say military, think intelligence and military, because surveillance is such an important part of the force. So you literally have the bankers running monetary policy, but then you have the military and intelligence backing it up. And you need both. It's like two hands of one coin. It's like two sides of a coin. Okay.
Right.
And what the bankers do, you grew up in the United States. Most people listening to this grew up in the Western world. And we've had for over a century a model where the bankers run monetary policy and then the people's representatives run fiscal policy. So the whole basis of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. That means the people's representatives, the Congress or the state legislature, run the fiscal policy is the way it's supposed to be. And what has happened in America for the last 20 years is we've had what I call a financial coup d'etat, where the bankers decided we can't trust the people and the people's representatives to manage the fiscal side, so we're going to change the model and we're going to take over control of both monetary and fiscal. And of course, if that succeeds, and it's gone very far, but it's not all the way. So let's say we've gone 70% of the way, we have 30 more to go. If that happens, then we lose the ability to determine taxation. In other words, we get no representation. If they want the money, they just take it out of our accounts.
Could you explain for a third grader what fiscal policy means?
Sure.
What monetary policy means?
It's monetary policy means I get to create the currency. Fiscal policy means I get to collect and spend the taxes.
Okay. Got it.
So let's look how your federal government works. Your federal government, grossly oversimplified, gets about half of its money to, fix the roads and do and run the military, and it gets the money by half of the money from taxing. So we all pay federal taxes, we all have fees, various fines, whatever.
Half the money comes from the taxes and half from where?
Half comes from the central bank.
Okay, got it.
The central banking mechanism right now, the currency is issued with debt. It doesn't have to be, but it is. So the New York Fed, so the Treasury, your bank account as a citizen is the New York Fed is the depository for your bank account. Okay, so they are the federal government's bankers. The Treasury account is at the New York Fed and its members' banks. So the New York Fed is owned by its members, but they also act as agent. So you're going to have the largest banks in the country owning and directing the New York Fed, choosing its president, but also, doing depository functions for the Treasury. So they, as agent, are also doing various things for the Treasury. Okay, so they have a function called primary dealer. And a primary dealer is authorized to go borrow money using Treasury bonds and bills. So they borrow money, so that's sort of part of how the currency gets into existence, and they put it in the Treasury bank account. So half comes from taxes and half comes from borrowing, a lot of that coming from your retirement account or my pension fund.
Wow.
Okay. So our retirement fund, or it could be a Norwegian pension fund or sovereign wealth fund, are buying Treasury bonds and the money's going into the bank account. And that's where half comes from, which is why if you're the president of the United States, it's like getting an allowance from dad. If you don't do what dad wants, You're not going to get your allowance. You don't have sovereignty. You don't have financial sovereignty. And you don't have information sovereignty because you, as the president, can't have a private telephone call. You got 17 intelligence agencies.
Even the president.
Especially the president.
Especially the
They'd
president.
much rather know what he's saying than you or I was saying,
I
right?
guess that's true.
Right. Okay.
Wow.
Right. So how are you going to run a government if you don't have information sovereignty and you don't have financial sovereignty? How are you going to do that?
That's a good question. What do you think?
So have you heard my red button story?
I believe I've heard your red button story. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what the red button story says is, since the American people want their check, they don't want you to say no to, the people who control the monetary. They want to keep so we are, the United States is a global leader in global money laundering and organized crime money.
Okay.
We're the global leader. And if that money stops, the red button story, and you can find it on the internet if you want to listen to it, but the red button story is people were not willing to push a red button to stop the organized crime flows because they wanted their checks to keep coming. So we have a financial dependency as a society on things, doing things that harm other people, including our own children, our own selves. So I talk a lot about the great poisoning. We have a tremendous number of industries in the United States that are making money from poisoning people and taking care of poisoned people, and they're very resistant to stopping the poisoning. Yes. Right? That's what this big debate is about, and it's a budget debate. So
are you talking about like food and healthcare, basically? Talking
about food, healthcare, spraying, what's in the pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
If you look at the federal budget, so let's go back to the model, the central banking warfare model. The key to the central banking warfare model is, if you're running the reserve currency for the world, the dollar system, you have to make more from running it. You have to make enough from running it to fund your military and intelligence. There's a lot of work in governing the sea lanes and being the global cop and running the trade model and all of that.
Yeah.
So you have expenses. And so when you hear the president yelling at everybody at NATO, like, you have to share more, what he's saying is that the subsidy from the dollar system minus the interest on his debt minus the cost of the military intelligence is no longer working, and he's got to rebalance the model.
The subsidy?
Yeah.
What do you mean by the subsidy?
So running the dollar system, you get to extract a tithe. So let's say tomorrow we created Danny Jones dollars. Okay. And whenever you wanted some, you could just print it off your computer.
Okay.
And you could pay people throughout this community for food or for services for doing your landscaping.
Okay.
With Danny Jones dollars that you could
have my own printer.
And you have your own printer. That's a big subsidy, right?
Okay. Yes, that is a big subsidy.
That is a big subsidy.
That's an unlimited subsidy.
It's not unlimited if you have to pay everybody in America off to go along with what you want to do. So part of the big cost of the running the model is the American people vote based on domestic issues and don't understand what's involved in running the whole global model.
Right.
And so you've basically got to buy them off and pay them off to get them to sort of go along with whatever you want to do.
Got it.
And that's expensive. So if you look what happened at the end of when the Soviet Union collapsed, the U.S. said, we want to be a unipolar model. One of the reasons I left Washington, I said, your plan won't work. And the failure in the Ukraine was the message. Plan failed. And now we have Rubio, the Secretary of State, saying, we're going to be it's a multipolar world now.
Yeah.
So the unipolar model failed. Mm-hmm. And so the model has to change. We're still running the reserve currency, but you have to rebalance the model. The unipolar plan didn't work, and it wasted a great deal of capital.
Right.
So now we have to change the model. And so if you see the president talking about, I want Canada to be the 51st state, or I want Greenland, he's trying, if he can't go east-west, remember, they were going to collapse the Soviet Union, get all those resources, and use that to maintain the unipolar model vis-a-vis China. Okay, that didn't work. So now he's talking going north-south instead of going east-west, right?
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So he's just trying to figure out, you have to change the model. And if you look at the debate and discussions going on in Washington, the unfortunate thing is whoever is in the White House, they have to change the model. They don't have a choice. The technology changes in the world, competition among various parties means we have to change the model. We have to evolve the model. We have to. And so the question is, how do you do it? And unfortunately, there are too many people in America sitting around and saying, wow, we don't want to change. But that's not, it's not changing because whoever's in the Oval Office now wants it to change. It's changing because they got to change. You have to change with the times.
I don't think most people even think about this kind of stuff. I think most people are more more focused on squabbles that are irrelevant to geopolitics or the financial system or the balance of power. That's how you keep them
away from the third rail. If I'm running this, I don't want the general population to mess with the third rail. Do you know what I mean by the third rail?
What do you mean by the third rail?
On a transit system or a railroad system, you have two tracks. That's where the wheels go. You have a third track. There's a little trim tab that flips over, and that's where the electricity runs.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So that's the power. Okay. And you don't want them messing with the power. So you keep them busy with divide and conquer and the unipolar pendulum and all that kind of stuff. But that has nothing to do with what's really going on.
Right. And when you say that they need the American people to pay for what they're doing, when you mentioned that earlier, were you specifically talking about individuals, or were you talking about like lobbyists?
So here's what I mean. If you look at the federal budget last year, so the 2025 year, we had a military budget of $857 billion. Yeah. And Hegseth wants to take it to $1 trillion. He says it needs to be $1 trillion. The HHS budget is $1.8 trillion. And that's because we're all poisoning each other. American people are poisoned. They're chronically ill. And our if you look at our healthcare system, it's almost double the cost of Switzerland's healthcare system. So we spend more per capita than just any country in the world by a lot. And so it's very expensive. And so Mark Skidmore, who is the professor at Michigan State University, who's helped me a lot to document all the money missing from the federal government, he just finished a calculation. We just did a show with him on the Solari Report. If we cut disability, so the number of people in America who are disabled, back down to 2010 levels, you would drop that HHS budget by $500 billion.
Wow.
Right. So that's what it costs to poison your population. And that's why this battle around the HHS budget and policies is so fractious, including the fact that the government is legally liable, if the truth comes out, for poisoning Americans. Which means if you look at what Toby Rogers says, Toby Rogers is the guy who's really tried to cost out the price of autism. So I got onto all of the HHS issues because I was an investment advisor. And what I discovered was that healthcare fraud was the number one cause of family bankruptcy or loss of family wealth. And number two, in my experience, was financial fraud. So people were just losing their wealth because they were being lied to. They were being lied to by the healthcare system.
By hospitals?
Everybody.
Really? Like legitimate healthcare organizations? Okay.
Yes. And many of those legitimate organizations really didn't know. I mean, my father was a very successful surgeon. I sort of grew up. Fortunately, we'd say, "Daddy, what did you do today?" And then he'd really tell us.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. No, the dinner table at our house was very... We used to read his surgical books for fun.
What kind of surgeon?
He had, during the World War II, they had taken the University of Pennsylvania Hospital and literally picked up most of the people and the organizational structure and moved it under Stilwell to Burma. So he grew up in, or he did his internship and residency in China, Burma, doing trauma. He was a MASH unit, right? And when he came back, because a lot of the big improvements they make in surgery happens in wartime because they have so much, so much opportunity. And when he came back, he worked and redesigned how the emergency room should work all over the country.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and well, it was really funny because both sides of my family, all the competition, there were very competitive people on both sides, but it was like, okay, who did the most to save civilization today? Okay, your grandfather did this and your father did that, and so, for example, his father had gotten the laws changed so they could bring penicillin to Tennessee and had introduced penicillin to Tennessee, and that had been a huge lifesaver for many people. So at the dinner table, it's like your grandfather brought penicillin to Tennessee. What have you done today?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So this idea that you talk about of the control grid.
Right.
Can you explain what the control grid is?
Sure. So let's say the way George Kennan at the end of World War II said we got 6% of the people and 50% of the resources. Mm-hmm. And to keep that going, we're going to have to be really tough. We're going to have to drop a lot of bombs. So Goldwater came along and he said, we're going to have to drop a lot of bombs and be really tough. And people said, no, we're good Christians. We don't want to, that's not us. Mm-hmm. So Jimmy Carter came along and he shivered in front of the fireplace and said, we're going to have to cut back. And the American people said, no, we don't want to do that. So then the Bushes, I always say the Bushes came along and said, you're all good Christians. Here's your check. Don't ask questions. Okay. So what we've been doing is we've been subsidizing the American people with the blessings of sort of racketeering around the world in the third world and running the warfare. So when you go from a unipolar to a multipolar model, you lose the ability to extract the resources you need to keep that going. So, for example, if I want to trade my Danny dollar for labor and resources all around the world, and the BRICS nations don't want to take the Danny dollar, then I'm losing the ability to subsidize the American way of life. Okay, so I have to cut back. Mm-hmm. So one way to cut back, so you can say, oh, well, there's a climate change emergency. We want everybody to cut back. You can try that. Or you can, throw on tariffs, and that's going to cause even more inflation. Everybody's going to cut back. But at some point, if you're really going to cut people back, it's very helpful if you have complete control. So if you're the bankers and you want to control fiscal policy and collapse the current constitution system, if you can exercise complete control with digital technology and an all-digital financial system, you have complete control. So go back to the pandemic. If we say, okay, we want you and your family to lock down, then suddenly your money won't work outside your house. You can order a pizza to be delivered, but you can't leave the house. If you have an electric car, ultimately you can turn off the electric car. And if they say, well, we want you to take the shot, it's mandated. If you don't take it, we'll turn off your money.
Right.
So you're talking about complete control.
And this would be utilized by spending the government money and giving people money, and in addition to having a centralized, controlled digital.
This would be used by using the private and the public sector financial train tracks to exercise complete central control. So I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a wonderful video that I keep showing of Augustine Carstens, the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, in 2020. I was brought up, basically, I was trained to be a central banker.
Okay.
And I had never seen a central banker tell the truth in open public in my life until I saw, when this happened, I almost fell off my chair. I was online with John Titus, who does the money market show with me.
Yeah.
And we were chatting as we were watching this IMF panel, and I freaked. I just said, did you see that? He said, don't worry, I got the clip. I said, that's, because in my world, it's impossible. Anyway, but here's what he said, and it's a 59-second video. You can run it if you want. If you go to our website, we have a section called Video Shorts, and in the Financial Transaction Freedom, we have about 100 short videos, and this is the first. he basically said, with digital technology, and he was explaining central bank digital currency, CBDC, but you can do it privately with stable coins. It doesn't have to be a CBDC. It can be a stable coin. And he said, we can make the rules of what you can do with your money,
right,
and we can enforce the rules of what you can do with your money.
Right.
So if they say, Danny, your health isn't what it should, you can't eat pizza. Your money won't work to buy pizza.
Right. Or you can't travel outside the limits of your area code or your zip code. Your credit cards turn off if you go out there, so you can't buy gas, you can't buy food. Right.
But the reality is, with AI and software, I can make a entirely granular control system just for you, one person at a time. Right. And so I can do it
it's
for
not a broad brush. It's very specific.
It's 8 billion, and I can collect all the data and apply my social credit system just to you. If you're good, you'll get, maybe you can travel a little bit more. If you're bad, you get locked down.
Maybe you can explain this to me, because I've never had anyone explain this to me before, but there was a story that came out a couple years ago, and I forget the name of the country, but there was a country somewhere in Eastern Europe where the United States basically offered to pay them like a couple $1 billion to mandate vaccinations and all these sort of controls during the pandemic, and they refused to do it, and they refused the money. But basically, the United States was paying another country billions of dollars for these mandates.
Right. Well, they do that all over the country and all over the world.
I don't understand that. I don't understand how that works. Can you explain, why? What is the benefit of us giving billions of dollars to some other random country on the other side of the world for them to lock down their own people?
So there could be many possible reasons, but one is prototyping. So, this is something you're planning on doing in your own country, and you want to see how you could get it to work in another country. And it's a prototype. A lot of times those are prototypes.
Okay.
So,
Steve, so you can find that article.
Yeah, help me to know which country it was.
Yeah.
Sounds like it might have been Hungary.
Oh, might have been Hungary. Yeah, you might be right. Yeah.
So I found I don't have access to it, but it says U.S. ends vaccine funds for poor countries.
No, it's not it. No. It might have been. It was something that came out where the president of that country made a public statement and called out the United States.
There was one guy who called out the United States, and then he had an assassination attempt. The 5 of the countries that refused to do the mandates in Africa, I have a big article about it. Their leaders either got assassinated or were thrown out in the next election.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, it might have been Hungary. Check on Hungary, but it was one of those countries right around there.
So, my guess is, because I worked for several years with a group of doctors and scientists trying to understand what was happening with the injections. And I absolutely believe that they were trying to install operating systems in people's bodies.
Operating systems.
Yeah. So
this just got dark.
No, if you listen, there's a great clip from right at the beginning of the pandemic when the chief scientist officer at Moderna says we're installing an operating system in people's bodies. And he, he's describing something that can be used plug and play for future vaccines. But if you look at all the material on the Internet of Bodies, you're talking about putting materials in people's bodies that make them basically easier to interact with telecommunications and with digital technology.
Oh, you're talking about the 5G stuff and how 5G can connect to this stuff.
So
these
we
nanobots. There's a whole. I've done a podcast on this before. It's so bizarre and out there and hard to grasp, but
it's not hard to grasp at all because
it just seems like sci-fi.
No, it's not sci-fi at all. It's not, just like they're tagging livestock. I mean, one of the things that really helps you to understand what this looks like, I live in a farming community in the United States, and if you've ever studied livestock management,
no, never.
A lot of this makes a lot more sense.
Okay.
And they are tagging all the livestock, but this is simply a way of if you get a lot of these nanoparticles into the human body, you're creating the equivalent of an organic barcode. Okay.
But I don't think there was actually any hard evidence that there was any nanoparticles.
So I strongly recommend you. We just published Patrick Wood at Technocracy News. I was the moderator. We just published the second symposium called Omnivore, and this one is called The Battle for the Brain, and it gets into the Internet of Bodies. And here's what I believe, and I'm not a scientist, so don't ask me to explain this at all, but if you look at all the patents and research and other work done on the Internet of Bodies, it is clear that there are mysterious ingredients in the food, there are mysterious ingredients in the spray, there are mysterious ingredients in the injections, and the question is what are those for? And I think it's very intentional. I don't think it's an accident. And I think one of the goals is, as the chief scientist officer at Moderna said, is to install an operating system in your body.
That's pretty dark.
Yes, it's very dark. So go to the Purdue Engineering website, to the Internet of Bodies, and look at the whole Internet of Bodies.
I'm sure you're familiar with the story of that guy Charles Lieber, who I think was a Harvard nanobiologist. There's actually a story I just saw on Twitter this morning. He just got hired by China to go work in a university in China. He got busted basically for like taking millions of dollars from China to send.
No, he got busted to keep him quiet, is what I believe.
He got busted to keep him quiet?
Quiet, right.
Explain. What do you mean by that?
So when you have a guy, so Charles Lieber is one of the world's leading experts on brain-machine interface, okay? And he was working with the guys in China, in a very significant way. And he was I think he was the top expert at Harvard on brain-machine interface.
Right.
And they went after him early, they went after him hard, and they put him in a process where he had to be entirely shut up. And then, so they authorized Operation Warp Speed, which, remember, is a military program. And who did they put in charge of it? But they put the former head of research at GSK, who is what? A brain-machine interface expert. The guy who ran Operation Warp Speed that Trump appointed was a brain-machine interface expert.
What was his name?
Oh, it's long.
Head of Glaxo.
Head of research.
Head of research.
He had been head of research
at GlaxoSmithKline.
Wow. And his expertise was brain-machine interface. And what's interesting, for many, many years, I've worked with Clifford Carnicom on global spraying. What's in the spray? What does it do to you? And Clifford insists, we just did a huge interview with him at the Facility Report, that the materials, the biosynthetic engineered materials in the spray are exactly what's in the injections. And don't ask me about it because I can't explain it.
Huh. Yeah, that's bizarre.
No, here's the thing. If you are running the planet and you are a risk manager and you're worried about all sorts of risks and you can't tell people what's really going on, the question is, you've got to turn the aircraft carrier before it hits the iceberg. And that may be 20 years before it hits the iceberg, and you can't get people to follow you. And so it's very attractive to have complete control and to be able, if you look at the amount of money that's spent to influence people to adopt this opinion or that opinion, or keep them busy or keep them away from the power line. The biggest investment almost in this society is persuading people, to believe a fake reality.
And how specifically, where does that money go specifically? Like, not just to news organizations or like TV networks, but do you have any or what is your understanding of how money is spent to influence ideas?
So the first thing, you spend a whole world of money on education to get the universities to present a certain kind of view of the world and to promote certain things. So it starts with education. A huge one, of course, is media. So media is also, in all the different ways it, from news to social media, is affirming and encouraging people to go certain ways. And it's not just official ways, like, oh, please go, vote in the next election.
Right.
It's entrainment. It's subliminal program. There's real mind control programming, and you're pumping that out where they're watching sports. You're pumping that out where they're watching porn. You're pumping that out to get them to think that certain things are real, other things are not real, to head them in certain directions. So you have enormous overt media and enormous covert media, right? That's affirming all those things. Now, your third big expenditure is on intelligence, because you're now tracking everybody. So with AI and software, I can track every person, and I can watch what they're thinking and saying and doing, and I can feed back to nudge them if I want them to go in a certain direction. So if I announce lockdowns and I want everybody to really lock down, then I persuade them this is all. I mean, we persuade everybody there was a pandemic when there was no pandemic, right? It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. It is pretty amazing having the ability to look back and see what happened, and the amount of persuasion that was going on from like the top down, and how it's basically done a 180 sense. It's we're in a world now where everyone has their own reality. Unfortunately, it seems like the idea of what is true is slipping away, and it's there's so many different flavors of reality, whether that be ideological, religious, political, whatever it is. It's everybody has just a different truth on so many different levels. It's almost impossible to have any consensus of reality anymore. And
I think it's very easy.
Do you?
Yeah, because if you just track the math of time and money, it's concrete. I mean, it doesn't lie.
That's why I love you. I think that's beautiful. That's
well, do you know how I came to it? I'm a little girl in West Philadelphia, but because of who my family was and where I went to school, in 1 week I would go back and forth between all these different worlds and cultures. And I couldn't make sense of anything because everybody was lying. They were lying to themselves. They were lying to each other. I was like, I've been born into a nut house here. Mm-hmm. And so finally I thought I have to find a way to navigate this. And so what I came up with was the mathematics of time. I love math, and that's my, math is one of my gifts. The mathematics of time and money. And what I discovered is if you could figure out the math of time and money, then you could figure out reality.
The math of time and money can figure out reality.
Where, how many hours, you just count up all the hours. Where are they putting their hours? Okay, count up all the money. Where are they putting their money? How do they spend their money? So I'll give you an example. When I was the assistant in 1984, I overheard two guys on Wall Street, billionaire types, talking about how they were going to roll out entrainment, subliminal programming on TV. And it scared me to death. And that was it for me in TVs. I never had another TV again until the administration. I had a friend helping me decorate. I bought a big house in Washington, and she bought a TV for me without my permission. And she said, you can't work in the Bush administration unless you watch the Sunday shows. So I had it for a little while, and then I gave it away because I hate them. And but because I was the FHA commissioner, I'm working with the budget for the home mortgage market. And if you're working with that and the at the time there was a big S&L cleanup. So I'm working with all the credit, the financial system in the budget. And because we're going through the 21, we competed for appropriations with 21 other agencies, I basically had to learn the whole budget. So I'm sitting there tracking day to day exactly what's happening in the budget. And then I'm watching, so we're over here whacking up the money in the budget. And you get on the Sunday shows and they're talking about what's going on. And they got this whole fantasy about what's really going on. It's got nothing to do with what's really going on. They're just like, well, yeah. And so for a year.
It's the Truman Show.
Exactly. It was the Truman Show. I'm watching. I know exactly what's going on because I'm looking at the money and I'm dealing with the money. And they're going la da 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 da. And it's entertainment. It's got nothing to do with what's going on.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, but if you follow, that's why,
What year was this?
That was 89 and 90.
89 and 90.
Yeah. 89 and 90. And that's why, so under the law, So at the time there were 4 mortgage insurance funds, but there are 2 of them are most of the money. So under the law, and the big one, the single family fund, by law, the first thing I did when I got to Washington is I read all the law related to what my responsibilities. I want to know under the law, what am I responsible to do? So I read the law, and it said that I had sole fiduciary responsibility for what was then the $320 billion mortgage insurance fund. And I was required by law to run it on a self-sufficient basis. So the premiums we charged for the credit had to cover the defaults and expenses. So I'm required to run it. So I decide, okay, I'm going to try and get how much money are we making or losing? So I called in the budget officer. They bring in the budget, and it would have gone 2/3 of the way to the ceiling with all the budget justifications. So I'm a speed reader. I read through it several times that weekend. I called the budget officer in on Monday. I said, nowhere in this budget does it say whether I'm making or losing money. He said, that's not in the budget. I said, if I have sole fiduciary responsibility to run this on a self-supporting basis, I need to know that.
Right.
He said, well, the accounts have that information. I said, well, give me their number. I'm going to call them. He said, they report to a different assistant secretary. You're not allowed to talk to them. And I said, well, that's going to change. So, no, I had raised a lot of money for George H.W. Bush, and all I got was a pair of cufflinks, and the accountants moved over to report to me. So I did. I used all my pull, and I got the accountants moved over to report to me. They come in the first day. We are losing $11 million a day in the single-family fund. So I said, look, all real estate's local. We got 10, at the time there were 10 federal regions, there are less now. I said, we have 10 federal regions, 80 field offices. Where are we making and losing money? He said, we don't have place-based financials. I said, we mail out checks. We have zip codes. I said, this is a rush. It's an emergency. Get the numbers. Yeah. Well, it turned out we were making profit in 8 regions and losing everything plus more in 2 regions, which was, it was a black budget fraud. It was the Bushes and the Clintons. It was the Texas region, which included Arkansas, and the Colorado region. It was just like...
It was a black hole of money just vanishing.
Yeah, it was the mortgage fraud. So you remember, we had a big, the SNL crisis in '89, and that cleanup was a tremendous amount of mortgage fraud. Anyway, so I could talk about all those guys in mortgage fraud all day long.
And then the day before 9/11, Rumsfeld says that we have, what was it, like $4 trillion that were just unaccounted for?
They were missing, DOD was missing $4 trillion, but he said 2.3.
He said it was 2.3.
But it was 4. And I was working with a reporter, and we had a huge story coming out that Friday about the whole missing money and what it meant per person. So we had calculated for each taxpayer in each state how much you were missing. So, yeah. So that was the financial coup, which had started in 1998.
And where did all that money go?
Well, that's what I've been trying to figure out. And without the bank statements, I can't, so I've tried to map out, because money, remember, you're too young to remember, did you ever see the old Pillsbury Doughboy commercials where they squeeze down on one and it pops out someplace else?
Oh, I don't know about that one.
Yeah, so you're probably too young. So when the money started to going missing from the Treasury and the federal government, the offshore havens started to just balloon, So this is going down and this is going up. And anyway, but I have tried to unpack where the money's gone and what they've been spending it on. And I have a lot of guesses. But
what's your best guess?
I think it's many different things. The first thing, I think you've been financing a new system. So I call it the breakaway civilization. But I think you've literally been financing a new system. And it's like when you're running a company and you keep the old systems going and you get the new systems up and you bring the resources over steadily. And then at some point you're ready to bring this down. And I used to say the pandemic was the breakaways breaking back in and taking over. But I think that they've moved a lot of money out. And in theory, if you look at how much has been stolen, it's enough to run a global government on an endowment basis. It is.
How much roughly total has been stolen?
So as of 2015, there was 21 trillion in undocumentable adjustments, but that's not cash, and it could reflect money coming in. So you could be bringing money in from the war zone. So how much is net missing? It's impossible to tell. But given everything, I would be amazed if it wasn't at least that much missing. So now, what I think you've been doing is you've been making enormous investments in black budget technology and infrastructure. So, so I think you've got a huge physical infrastructure. Some of it, when you did 9/11, you were able to move a lot more black budget on budget. And so that sort of eased the pain, because the problem with the black budget as of 9/11 was to get that money, you had to tell, it had gotten, the fraud had gotten so dysfunctional and wasteful. So you wanted to do more on budget. But, whether it's building a new governance system and a new endowment to run it, or invisible weaponry, secret space program, the infrastructure underground to platform that, I think it's all those things.
One of the theories that has been bouncing around in my head from recent guests that I've had on is that military contractors have been taking money from the U.S. government and from the Pentagon to develop futuristic weaponry, develop new physics, alternative propulsion, crafts that have some sort of alternative propulsion systems since the 70s, or even actually probably since the 50s, I think.
Here's how it works. Okay. 47. Do you understand the legal structure of how they did it?
No.
Okay. 47, you passed the National Security Act. Okay. And that gives you the ability to set up the secret infrastructure. 49, you passed the CIA Act. They literally had to kill the Secretary of Defense to do that. They assassinated Forrestal to get that done. We have a lot of interesting material on the Forrestal assassination on the Solarian. You should go through. Yeah, you should learn about Forrestal and what caused that assassination and what it did to create. You literally took several sections.
Wasn't he a KKK guy? Okay.
Not that I know of. He was the president of Dillon Reed. He was a partner of Dillon Reed.
Okay.
Okay.
I thought he was in the KKK for some reason. I might be thinking of someone else. Never mind.
I don't know. I've never read that about Forrestal. I really studied him, but I don't know.
Okay.
So
don't worry about it, Steve.
Well, even if he was, that's not what got him killed. What got him killed was standing in the way of creating Israel and giving them the nuclear bomb. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. And he wanted disclosure on the black budget. He was for disclosure on the black budget, and he didn't want Israel. He didn't want that part of the organized crime syndicate to get sovereign powers. So anyway, what happened was they made a deal on the 49. They got rid of Forrestal. They made a deal on the 49 Act. That created the CIA.
Okay.
And that made the CIA the most powerful banker in the world. Eisenhower put him in charge of Area 51 security. And literally, once you look at how the Exchange Stabilization Fund and sort of the different money aspects of the 47 and 49 Act organized to work, you've now created this financial mechanism that combines covert violence and makes it the most powerful banker in the world. I should say, on the covert side, the most powerful bank in the world is BIS.
Didn't they use, I could be wrong about this, but didn't Dulles take a bunch of money from the budget to rebuild Europe after World War II to build Area 51? That's what I don't
know if he used that to build Area 51. He ran a slush fund out of the Exchange Stabilization Fund from Sullivan Cromwell and before they got the 49 Act created. And part of that was to create this infrastructure, because part of it said you can appropriate to all the different agencies and then claw it out secretly to give it to the intelligence agencies. Right. So they created, after World War II and all the slush fund money they got from World War II, they created a mechanism to constantly replenish the covert money. But here's the big thing. When Bush came in during the Reagan years as vice president, his deal with the intelligence agencies was he gets to run, or with Reagan, was he gets to run the National Security Council and the intelligence agencies. He creates an executive order signed by the president, by Reagan, that corporations can do highly classified work. Now, let me tell you what that means. What that means is the Treasury can issue an infinite number of bonds and use that money to pay corporations to do highly secret things, including just gifting them all of the black technology funded by the taxpayers and moving it onto their balance sheet, and do it in a secret way that generates enormous profits in the stock market.
Wow.
Okay. So now you've got a way. Now, what's the number one source of campaign contributions?
Companies like this.
Capital gains.
Capital gains. Okay.
Capital gains. I have a stock. It's trading at a multiple of 20. I give you $1 million a year contract. That goes up by $20 million. Your stock goes up. That creates capital gains for the investors and the executives, who then turn around and they or their law firms make political contributions. It's a kickback system.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand.
So if you read my book, I have an online book called Dylan Reed and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits, and it was designed to explain to you how that kickback system works.
Right.
Because, and the quote we have at the beginning is an old New Jersey street saying, make a law, make a business. So every time the government does something that makes stocks go up, they get a kickback of campaign contributions from that.
Right.
And of course, the taxpayers funding the whole thing. Now, let's go back to corporations. Now I can transfer trillions of dollars of invaluable black technology into the corporations and fund them with taxpayers' money to own and develop it secretly and keep it away from FOIA. So you and I can put in a FOIA and we can't find it because it's behind the corporate veil.
Right. Now, one of the fears about this is that allegedly since the 50s when they started working on some of this stuff, is that it's gotten so advanced in these black corporate or these black military industrial complex aerospace corporations, whatever you want to call them, that they've become essentially more powerful than the U.S. military because of the technology that they have they own.
Now, I can't say that it's more powerful than the U.S. military because they need the U.S. military to do a lot of what they're doing.
Well, essentially, the way it was described to me is that these corporations or these organizations basically are so powerful and have such advanced technology that they have their own Air Force, their own their own Navy, everything.
Right. And we've had senators stand up and say this, but what I call them is a breakaway civilization.
Right.
They have broken away and they are so much more advanced. Now, if you look at their assets, what I would say, if I could assert jurisdiction, those are our assets. Those were either gifted or stolen. They belong to us.
Right.
But it's not corporations who have a lot of technology. It is a breakaway civilization, and they literally think of themselves as a separate civilization and not subject to our laws.
Separate from not only the United States, but separate from the world, from all nations.
Separate from the human race.
Separate from the human race.
Right. In other words, so I'll give you an example, and I've told this story many times before. When I was at HUD, I was in a meeting with the secretary, and we had called in the regional administrator, so we had 10 regional administrators, and he was very angry at the regional administrator from California because he had implemented a court decision. A court had decided something, he had implemented it, and the secretary was very angry at him, and he said to him in front of everybody, "Mr. Secretary, I had to, it's the law." And the secretary just explodes with fury, says, the law, I don't have to obey the law. I report to a higher moral authority. And that's a perfect example. When you're in Washington, you have a group of people whose attitude is, look, as long as I'm doing what the bankers tell me to do, I don't have to obey the law. The law's irrelevant to me. You know, I'm part of the breakaway law. You know, I have to obey them. I don't have to obey this law.
Now, as far as this quote unquote breakaway civilization, we have these private military industrial complex aerospace weapons development agent companies, and we also have these banks. How connected are they? And like what, I know you've talked about like space research and even developing underground facilities, these deep underground, is it the same thing? These DUMBs, these deep underground military bases.
Right.
They're investing in all this stuff simultaneously.
That's what it appears to me to be.
Okay.
So, and remember, a lot of the underground bases are publicly announced or known as existing. So, you know, and there's a lot of things you would do or store underground, just any good risk manager would do it. So it's a continuity of government thing to have those kind of facilities.
Right.
So, you know, but I think my guess is the infrastructure is a lot greater than has been publicly made aware of.
Like they have full cities under there that would be livable.
That's what some, you know, I don't know if you've ever watched the different videos of the truckers, but if you spend a lot of time talking to the truckers, because the truckers have to deliver a lot of material into those bases, and you'll get a lot of reports about what they've seen or heard. So that's my
Have you
guess.
seen the videos of those salt mines? There's like giant salt mines over somewhere in
Poland? Are you thinking?
Maybe Poland, yeah. And they're just enormous. They're just these caverns with like, I would say they're 100 feet tall on the inside. And it looks like New York City underneath a mountain.
Really?
They're insane. And I mean, I would imagine it could be easily converted into some sort of underground city, but they're salt mines apparently. And there's just like lines of semi-trucks driving through them.
So I live half the year in the Netherlands, and the power of Northern Europe grew up on the fish.
Look at that right down there.
Oh wow!
Bizarre.
Yeah, I bet that's Poland. I don't know.
So, yeah, where's it at, Steve?
It's huge salt mine planetarium. I don't know.
Click the link. Boop, 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 boop. About.
Dracula grave? Really?
You can find it, Steve.
Northern
We believe
Europe
in you.
Grew up on the cod and fishing. You know, a huge amount of the wealth in Northern Europe came from the ocean, from the fish.
Right.
But so I live in Friesland, and one of the things that made the Frieslands were amazing world travelers, and they figured out how to get the salt from the Polish mines and salt the cod. So you could put cod in a barrel, salted, and you would have animal protein that was good for 10 years, so you could sail anywhere in the world.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, it's in Romania.
Romania.
All the way out.
Okay, well that would be consistent with Dracula's grave.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There's insane photos and videos of this place that are just mind blowing and kind of terrifying too.
It reminds me of Total Recall.
Yeah, look at that. That's wild.
So I will tell you that in my opinion, you have a corporate infrastructure which is literally out of control. So one of the things, I used to have these fights with the defense contractors because I was required to get the accounts when I still needed data, and the systems were run by the big defense contractors at HUD. And they would refuse to give me the data. So I'd have these wars with them. It's like, who really runs HUD? Is it the defense contractor, or is it the person who's legally responsible?
Right.
You would have these huge fights.
And then, one of the biggest problems is, like you were alluding to earlier, is they control the government by lobbying, right? Like they
can control the government by killing people who don't do what they say. That's how they control the government.
Right. And lobbying.
Lobbying, I mean, they're different layers, but, I'll give you an example. So I litigated with the federal government for 11 years and then fought with the IRS. And anyways, 11-year shaggy dog process. And when it was over, I didn't want to go back into the investment world without explaining what had happened. So I wrote an online book called Dylan Reed and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits. I've tried to publish it 3 times. The last time, each time I ran into just enormous headwinds and problems and threats. But the last time they threatened to kill somebody in my family. So I just...
What?
Yeah.
Who?
I can guess where it's coming from. I know how it was delivered. and I know who delivered the messages, but who started it, I can guess, but I don't know. But I took them seriously. I thought, okay,
it was delivered through somebody like in person, through somebody you know.
Yeah, yeah. Two were acquaintances, one was somebody I know, but it's very carefully crafted so that the people who deliver the message don't necessarily understand what they're a part of. But
right.
And I thought there was a reasonably good chance that they would do it. So I did. You never know.
And you just published this book on your website?
It was already on.
Oh, it was already online.
It was already online, so I just left it online. It's not censored. It's there.
Right. Okay, so so first of all, what is the Bank of International Settlements and how are they tied to this breakaway civilization?
So the Bank of International Settlements is a central bank of central bank. So the 63 largest, most important central banks in the world belong to the BIS. The top central bankers meet there regularly. They have a group called the Financial Stability Board that defines systemically important institutions, which to me appear to essentially get some of the benefits of their sovereign immunity. And they have the power to move money and hold it on their balance sheets secretly. So if there's 21 trillion missing from the U.S. government, in theory, you could move that 21 trillion to the BIS and have it sit on the BIS all day long and use the BIS to move it to lots of countries who then donate to the Gates and Clinton Foundation, for example.
Oh, wow.
I'm using that as a theoretical example.
Sure.
See what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But because they have sovereign immunity, we've created since World War II a whole network of organizations around the world who have sovereign immunity. They're above the law. So we have, we have parts of the UN, we have the World Bank, we have the IMF. They have all sorts of different variations of sovereign immunity. We have a bunch in Latin America. And we've created this metastructure using international treaties or using the sovereign immunity entities for all sorts of behavior and economic activities that are not subject to our national laws.
Essentially for running the world, because if you want to run the world, you can't obey the laws. If you're the, I think you've used this analogy before. If the world is your house,
right,
and you're the owner of the house, there are certain things that you have to do that...
Right, and it allows you to move a lot of money and a lot of data and information secretly.
Right. And these are and who are, like, when we talk about these banks and the people that are running these banks, like, do we know who the individuals are?
So if you look at the member banks that run the New York Fed... Yeah, so we know who the board of directors and we know who the stated investors are, and we know who the, we know who the CEO and executives are. It's all in the United States. It's all published information.
Okay, so like when it comes to people, like, I know, everyone likes to, when they talk about the people who run the world, most people want to say like George Soros, the Rockefellers,
right?
These types of people, these international type people that seem to have influence all over the world.
So in my experience, the system is run through committees, consensus. So I'll give you an example. When I was on Wall Street, a lot of the money in the United States is run around the federal budget. Okay, because it's such a big portion. Mm-hmm. In any county in America, 40 to 50% of the income comes from the federal budget.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it really drives the economy. Okay, so the appropriations vote out, sort of their plan for the next year. And so their recommended appropriations come out from the committees. And then the big questions, the big things to be debated or figured out or questions are rolled up and sent out to the Bohemian Grove. Everybody comes out to the Grove, they meet, and they chew over the big things, and then they make their decisions, and then that goes back to Washington. Everybody's on vacation, and then the staff gets everything ready to vote for the budget in September, and then the new budget goes forward in October. And if that process breaks down and you have a real food fight, then you've got a real mess. But the big decisions are made by consensus, and you use, whether it's a Bilderberg meeting or
Council of Foreign Relations.
They're a little bit different, but
Okay.
our executive committee of the Council on Foreign Relations. You have these meetings where you get people from all different industries, all different occupations together so they can coordinate and collaborate. And they make these decisions very much by committee or consensus process, which is why once they agree to something, everybody hates to, you can't bucket because, we've told 20 different industries we're going to go to the right. And so you can't just go to the left. You hiccup everybody.
What can you explain to me exactly what the Bilderberg Summit is all about?
So I'm not that familiar with the Bilderbergers. I mean, I never, if you look at who I worked with,
Yeah.
I mean, I worked with some people on Wall Street or in Washington who were in the Bilderbergers, but it was simply a more international version. And my guess is if you look at, we grabbed so much booty at the end of World War II. I think that one of the initial goals of the Bilderbergers was to manage that, that sort of pot of money.
I heard that Peter Thiel and Eric Schmidt were the representatives in the United States for the Bilderberg Summit.
So more recently, that's possible because the tech is so important to build the control. Mm-hmm. So, I hate to say it, the 21 trillion is, we sort of sucked out as much money as possible and put the government on a debt trap. But if you look at what they're doing now they're stealing all the data. And it looks to me like they're building up to steal the rest of the assets.
What's left?
There's, if you have an AI and you want to build a control grid and a social credit system, the most valuable data you need is payment data. And so taking the Social Security, the IRS, and the Treasury payment data, it's the most valuable data or some of the most valuable data in the world.
Oh, wow.
Right. So that's worth, it's funny, Naomi Wolf and I were trying to cover this at one point, and she said, that data is worth more than $1 trillion, and it is. And it's interesting because Musk was out raising capital for XAI and had a deal with Palantir AI at the same time. And my guess, I think...
Palantir has an AI?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Well, according to published reports, XAI and Palantir had made a partnership, and when Musk was sucking all this data out. And my guess is that data is, they sucked it into the AI on the just do it method.
What do you make of everything Elon is doing and Doge and buying X and...
Well, let me come around to that.
Okay.
And I'll the other thing is, and this is from a video, an interview Howard Lutnick said. He said, don't worry about so he's the Secretary of Commerce, but he was a primary dealer. And he was the guy who lived next to Epstein for many years. Okay. Mm-hmm. He lived next door. Okay. Right. So Lutnick says, don't worry about the $36 trillion of debt because we have, on the U.S. balance sheet, we have 500 trillion of land and mineral resources, which is true. The federal government owns a huge amount of the land in the United States. Oh, wow. Right. And during Trump, in fact, he ordered up a geological survey that would allow basically to map 100% of the mineral resources in the country. So if you want to plunder the U.S. balance sheet, it's worth a fortune. It could create, new kind of Rothschild and Rockefeller fortunes if you plundered it.
This is crazy stuff.
No, it's not. It's just money.
It's just money.
No, but here's the thing. We have one problem in the United States. We have a secret governance system. And that secret governance system has decided to change how we're governed and managed. And we're having a big disagreement because they want central control, and digital technology will allow them to do that for the first time in history. And we don't want that. We want to be free. So we're having a big debate about whether or not we're going to go to a complete control grid or we're going to be free. That's the debate. And whether the breakaways can break back in and say, okay, we're dictating to you, now that we've stolen you all your money, we're going to dictate to you how you're going to live.
So who is it that specifically that wants this control grid? Is this just some evil group that is decentralized from the U.S. government, somehow has control over them? Or is this sort of just like a diaspora of good and evil that is littered throughout the entire U.S. government?
So, think of this as a dynamic discussion back and forth between the population and the people who are responsible to manage the planet. And, if you come up through the layers of the financial system, both the bankers, the insurance, the whole thing, and then the people who make the top governance decisions, and I can only guess who they are, but I have some guesses. They are responsible for the intergenerational pools of capital, and they were responsible for risk. And they, over the last 50 years, in my experience, they have been exceptionally frustrated. And they find managing the general population very frustrating and scary. Because remember, occasionally you have revolutions and people get guillotined, right?
Yeah.
So they're afraid. My personal experience is they're very afraid of the general population because they are few and we are many.
Right.
Right. And they're risk managers, and they think in very, very long. And what's happened is, particularly in the United States, you have a huge cycle of disrespect now between the general population and the people responsible to lead the financial system. And the more the criminals get away with really bad stuff, the more they hate the general population. And it's become a very ugly cycle of disrespect, in a way that didn't exist when I was a kid. So, and that is dangerous because, well, look at the Great Poisoning. I mean, we have the U.S. government systematically poisoning and killing the population. The COVID pandemic was a mass atrocity. You've killed millions, or you've killed or disabled millions of Americans intentionally.
And why do you think specifically they did? Does this have anything to do with depopulation?
It has to do. So the budget deal in 1995 broke, and that was it was described to me by the top pension fund. The president of the largest pension fund in the country described it to me in 1997. He said, they've given up on the country. They're moving all the money out starting in the fall. So a concerted effort was made to put the government and the retirement system on a sound financial basis. It didn't work. They decided, okay, we're just going to start pulling money out. That's when the financial coup started. And that is when decisions started to be made that systematically lowered life expectancy. And from 2000 to 2017, well, ever since then, I've been on every radio show or internet show that will have me talking about the 21 trillion missing. And that's because it's a formula. You have retirement funds. If you won't fund them, and the political wheel made it very clear in 1995, we refuse to fund them. You only have another way to balance the budget, and that's to lower life expectancy. And
so we don't have to pay them.
Well, if you look at the charts, literally from when that budget deal busted, life expectancy started to fall. So here are the other 19 industrial countries, and here's the U.S., and it starts to go down, 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 and then the pandemic, it drops off the cliff. And the divergence between... during the pandemic, the people that were most affected were elderly or people that were, already on death's door with multiple comorbidities. It's a little bit more complex than that. But yes, and the latest reports from Social Security is it's working. Social Security has improved. So, but here's the thing. I'm going to be a tough guy. This is a formula. So you either put the money in...
Tapering the Ponzi scheme. I've heard.
It's not a Ponzi scheme, but if you're not going to fully fund it, then you can lengthen retirement age or you can lower life expectancy. It's a formula.
Right.
And if the body politic refuses to do the financially responsible thing, then you got two choices, and you can't get there by delaying the retirement age. That won't work politically. So you just poison the pop. You just put them on a slow kill. And that's what's happened. And you can say, oh, the bankers are bad guys. But if you saw the confirmation hearings for Kennedy's appointment, I mean, what you saw were scores of senators
Yes.
Refusing to take responsibility for a chronic epidemic among our children, which is an extinction level event. That, that was not the banker sitting in the City of London. That was senators sitting in Washington and refusing to take responsibility. It's one thing to say to Kennedy, we don't like your plan to end the chronic epidemic, of illness among our children. Here's a better plan. But they wouldn't own it. They just want to say, no. It was, that is a society that will fail. I mean, that's that. If you've ever,
this is because a lot of those congressmen and senators were paid for by pharmaceutical companies, right?
There are many plausible explanations, none of them good.
Right.
So they could have control files. They could be bribed. They could be mind controlled. They could be not care. They could, there are many possible reasons, none of which are good. But what they're not is they're not competent to be a U.S. senator.
Right, totally.
Right. They don't.
Wow.
Right. And if I'm the bankers and I want to control fiscal policy, I've proven on national TV that the people who run fiscal policy are not competent to run it. Because the HHS budget is bankrupting the country. And it's not just bankrupting the country. I was an investment advisor for 10 years, and the way I learned all about this, is watching the healthcare system bankrupt families. So that's my, what I'm angry about is there is no reason why our economy can't be highly prosperous and successful. But it can only be successful if the people are successful, if our children are successful, if our families are successful. That's what it takes to have a successful civilization.
But how do you push back this sort of, for lack of a better term, crony capitalism that seems to be intrinsically tied to the U.S. government, and it seems like all that matters is that, and the people are like the middle class is being gutted. There's more billionaires being gutted.
Here's what you do. The first thing you do is you bring transparency. So that's your business, right? You're trying to bring transparency to what's going on, right? Second thing is you describe the solutions. And the real solution is when millions of us proceed to behave, because right now, the people who are implementing all the evil doing, all the poisoning, all the control grid, the people who are implementing it, you know who they are? Us. We're implementing this. I could walk into a room of health freedom activists, get all their retirement funds, pull together all the stocks and show them they're financing it. They're putting, they're supporting, we are going to work and implementing this. We are putting our money into this, and we have the power to change that overnight. If 10% of the people in the country called up their broker and said, I am not financing any of this evil doing, pull my money out of all these bad guys, I'm not going to buy them, I'm not going to support them, I'm not going to date them.
Pull our money out of the banks.
No, pull your money, shift your money to the banks that are good. You've got a tremendous number of great banks and honest bankers in this country who would love to diminish this.
What are the good banks?
So if you go to Solari, we have an article called How to Find a Good Local Bank, and we have a 4-part series on how to identify and find a great bank or credit union.
Okay.
But I
take it JP Morgan's not one of the good ones.
So we have a very interesting document. If you do a search on Solari for JP Morgan Chase.
Oh, really?
We had a subscriber after the financial crisis, and in my personal experience, JP Morgan was deep in the mortgage fraud at FHA and the government. Mm-hmm. So she continued to bank at JP Morgan Chase, and I don't know if you know how the Madoff fraud worked.
Yes, I'm familiar.
Okay, so Madoff after the mid 90s he had 2 businesses. He had a brokerage business, and he had the money management, the Ponzi scheme. Mm-hmm. And the Ponzi scheme only had one bank account at JP Morgan Chase. So I was interviewing Helen Chapman, who was one of the attorneys who litigated the Madoff. She'd been a Madoff victim but represented other Madoff victims. And I said to her, Helen, who was the securities custodian If JP Morgan Chase was the bank account, who was the securities custodian? And she said there was none because he never bought any securities. And I said, but Helen, that means JP Morgan Chase controlled the whole time. In other words, under the laws, they knew that Madoff was not buying any securities because there was no securities custodian, and the money. In fact, they would run with huge balances at JP Morgan Chase, according to her interview.
Wow.
Right. They were the senior partner.
That's insane.
They were the senior partner. So it's an amazing interview. Anyway, so I had this person put together a list of every criminal and civil money penalty that JP Morgan Chase had paid from 2006 to, I think it's 2018. It's up at Solari. And then we had our editors go through it very, very carefully. And we found $42 billion of civil and criminal money penalties for financial, activities that I would describe as, they clearly knew they were defrauding people and harming people. And, so my question is, why is anybody, if an institution would do that, now I can make arguments where it makes sense for somebody to have their money at JP Morgan Chase for things we don't need to go into. There's all sorts of esoteric reasons. But I would say that a majority of people who are free to move their money out of JP Morgan Chase, why don't they? Why wouldn't you act in your own?
So convenient. The app, have you ever used the app? It's great. They got Zelle. You can send money with Zelle to anyone super easily.
So having been...
I don't think people have time to think about this stuff, like normal, everyday working people.
So you're saying that you would do business with the Russian mob because it's convenient?
I mean, if I knew I was doing business with the Russian mob, no, I wouldn't do that.
Right. So what I'm telling you is, if you will do business with people who steal and defraud, then I
would choose not to if I knew about it.
Crime that pays is crime that stays. Okay. So, I mean, if you look at the financial crisis, we shoveled $27 trillion of taxpayers' money into institutions. So that was a huge theft. That was a huge taking. Why would you ever bank with any of those institutions if you could avoid it?
Right.
And there are times some people can't avoid it, so I'm not. But I mean, I'll never forget being in Washington. There's some big protest, and one of the guys said to me is, "Look, as long as they have Citibank credit cards in the back of their pocket, I don't care if they walk up and down." Why? Because that's
traceable, right? They're tracking.
Well, as long as you're giving me all your data and you're giving me all your money, and I control your money and your data.
Control the money and the data. Yeah.
What do I care if you walk up and down?
But so Trump has been this current administration, this new administration, or at least when Trump was running, he was very pro Bitcoin.
But Trump was put in by the bankers to get the control grid. The other team in the Uniparty wasn't moving fast enough. They couldn't get the control grid.
I knew it.
I sent you a link. We just did a new collection of all the things Trump is doing to move the control grid. He is moving very, very fast. When it comes to building... First, he's getting the Real ID implemented very aggressively. Real ID, to do a control grid, you need a very high-quality, precision national ID that's interoperable with all the other IDs around the world. And he's got Kristi Noem out there pushing the Real ID like there's no tomorrow. So they're working, and it's done through the states, but the feds are pushing it. So the first thing you need is a digital ID. The second thing you need is an all-digital financial system. So you got to kill cash, and you got to make everybody interact digitally. And if you look at what he's doing with taxes and Social Security, he's trying to make everybody, he's canceled pennies, but he's also canceled now. Normally I pay my taxes with paper, and now he's saying, no, you got to do everything digital. It's not this year, but next year.
Really?
So he's trying to, if you go through that list, I've got 50 different items of what he's doing. And if you look at what they're doing with the Genius Act and stablecoin, he said no CBDCs, but stablecoin. So I don't know if you've read the Genius Act, which is the new plan for stablecoins. Okay. A CBDC would be issued by the Federal Reserve, so presumably the New York Fed and the Fed member banks, okay? Now, they are owned by their members. So Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, they own as members, they own the New York Fed and, basically govern it. Okay. And the New York Fed is the depository for the Treasury, and the different banks work as agent to do those transactions. Okay. So now under the Genius Act, what they're saying is the guys who own the New York Fed are all going to create subsidiaries and issue stablecoin, which will be interoperable and can work with a social credit system. Now, here's the beauty of it. The New York Fed, under the law, has direct obligations to Congress, and Congress has jurisdiction over them. If you do it through the owners of the Fed, through their private subsidiaries, you're going to have some degree of freedom. So it gives you more freedom.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So if you think this is improvement, you have another thing coming. Anyway, but what they're planning to do on stablecoin, which I have to say as a financial matter is quite clever. Remember the pallets of cash you sent to Iraq?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. This is going to be the digital equivalent of the pallets of cash sent to Iraq, because what they want to do is stablecoins. So a stablecoin is just a bank deposit or a treasury bill or bond. So it's fully collateralized by $1. Mm-hmm. You put $1 in, and these stablecoins are going to, you have some stablecoins that do gold or other things, but these are going to be $1. Mm-hmm. And this is going to create a huge market for the treasury bills and bonds. And the bank subsidiaries will create the stablecoins, so it'll be fully collateralized in treasury bonds or bills. Mm-hmm. But then you can send them out on Google Payment and Apple Payment and all the wallets around the world. And literally, you can get people from Bolivia to South Korea coming into your state and using stablecoins. So you're literally going to tender for the global population, try and get everybody off of their local currency into stable coins, and you're going to pump out massive amounts of private credit to make it really attractive. So you're just going to hand out money and get everybody on the dollar.
And you don't think the BRICS would try to compete with this?
Of course.
They would, right?
Yeah, of course.
And do you think this is something that could legitimately be implemented? And if so, how soon do you think they would start doing this?
I think as soon as you pass the Genius Act, it can go very, very fast.
And where are we at right now with the Genius Act and it getting passed?
I'm assuming it's going to pass sometime soon. If it doesn't pass before the session breaks, it'll pass in the fall. Is my guess. So it could, you could really see the world rock. Now, our problem in America
is Trump aware of all this stuff, or what do you think? What do you think what is his motive in all of this? Or not his motive, but is he basically a useful idiot here?
So I don't know Trump. Yeah. I lived in New York for 11 years, and the PR firm we use did his business too. Everything I know about Trump, I know from Howard Rubenstein and company. Wow. Anyway, but I think Trump is in a box, and all I see, I have to judge people by what they're doing, and what it looks to me like Trump and Musk are implementing the control grid at high speed. And don't believe me, go look at that list, because what you have to say is, okay, to do a control grid, we need a digital ID implemented that's very high quality, high precise. Check the box. We need an all digital financial system. Check the box. We need a way of doing interoperable money. Check the box. If you look at what Doge is doing, we need a social credit system. Check the box.
Wait, what do you mean by that? What Doge is doing?
Doge is, from what it looks like to me, and I'm basing my assessment of what I know from Doge includes, I read the Financial Times, I need to read the Wall Street Journal, and I need to read Wired. Wired has done a very thorough job of trying to document what's happening in the systems. Mm-hmm. And I think basically what they've done is they've taken... So if I wanted to stop fraud in the U.S. government, I would say there's $20 trillion missing from DOD, there's $1 trillion missing from HUD. I'm going to go in, figure out where it went, get it back.
Right.
That's not what they did. If you said to me, I want to build a social credit system that can be used to enforce control against the American people and basically lock them down with both enforcement and social credit, I would go get the Social Security data, the IRS data, and the Treasury payment data, and that's exactly what they did. and I would privatize it. I would just take it and put it in private AI with XAI and Palantir AI, and if Palantir still has the contracts with Treasury and the IRS to enforce, you got everybody. And you add the Kennedy's aggregating the healthcare data, you put it with the healthcare data. Now Danny, they've been aggregating this kind of data. I used to call it the data beast. So they've been aggregating this kind of powerful data since the 90s. So I don't think this is all new. So, for example, you
IRS data, healthcare data, and combining it all together into one system combined with AI.
Right. But I think this time the federal government has generally done a pretty good job of siloing the data to protect privacy laws for many applications. But I think this unsilos everything and moves it private and puts it on an out-of-control basis is my guess as to what's probably happened. Now, this is conjecture, remember, but if I wanted to build a control grid, that's exactly what I would do.
Wow. Let's take a quick break.
Okay.
I got to use the restroom. We'll be right back.
And I did a great 2-hour interview called Who is Mr. Global? And we went through every different hypotheses.
What do you mean? Can you define Mr. Global?
It's the committee that runs the world. So there's a committee at the top that makes all the big decisions. And my nickname for it is Mr. Global. So the question is, who is Mr. Global and why is Mr. Global doing what he's doing? Because when I look at a situation, I like to put myself in somebody else's shoes. Like if I was Danny and I was doing this, what would it look like from my point of view? And so I want to put myself in why is Mr. Global doing this? What's Mr. Global's point of view? So anyway, so Joseph and I went through and did who is Mr. Global and why is he doing what he's doing? So we went through all the theories, but some of my favorite comments on the internet is they'll say, well, she worked at the White House and she knows, so she's not telling us. It's like, no, everybody at the White House is not sure.
Who's your best guess of who Mr. Global is?
I think you have intergenerational pools of capital, and right now they are over influenced by a cult. Yes, so I think you have interdimensional intelligence, which is operating demonic intelligence.
Interdimensional demonic intelligence.
Yeah. Wow. Yep. So I think this thing about good and evil is real, and I can't find it anymore. I found it once. There were in the 30s. The British physicist got up and said, we are being manipulated, but from other dimensions by intelligent beings from other dimensions. So I think if you study Christianity and you read the Bible, you're dealing with both divine intelligence and demonic intelligence. And I think too much of the leadership has got deeply involved in the occult and demonic kinds of intelligence.
Wow.
So I just read a book and I have no idea. So I've tried to find every theory to explain the paranormal stuff. So I'm not telling you this is true, but I just finished reading a book called Final Event by Nick Redfern. I don't know if you've ever read it. And he describes it's a exploration of a group of military intelligence in the United States called the Collins Elite.
Oh yeah, I've heard about the Collins Elite. Yeah.
And they came to believe that the ET phenomena was a demonic phenomena. It was not people from another planet. It was demonic intelligence. It was
biblical stuff.
Right. And one of the things he discovered was that, or the Collins Elite apparently discovered, is in many sort of ET abduction events, if you called on Jesus Christ, it would stop.
What?
Yeah. That's what he reported, and he strikes me. I don't know anything about him, but it struck me as someone who was trying to do a faithful job of simply reporting what they found.
There's a lot of folks in the intelligence community that publicly state how they believe that the whole UFO phenomena is like this biblical thing. How it's angels and demons, and these things could be angelic entities, and like literal, like ground, like legitimate people in the intelligence community, whether they're still active or retired or whatever, that have been on podcasts that state they believe this.
So I am sure that all of that stuff is happening. So I think we are dealing with demonic and angelic forces in our world, and that's interdimensional intelligence. So the Bible calls it, demons and angels. Other people call it fifth dimension or whatever, but I think we're absolutely, and I will tell you what I think